decision process. However, despite having the opportunity to buy back their pensions, they were ultimately forced to exit. With the pause under the PSPGO Act 2022, this discrimination continues and prevents officers from retiring. Will the Minister provide an update on a proposed resolution and a timescale on when these officers will be able to buy back their pensionable term under the 1987 scheme as agreed to remedy the group of affected police officers? And can the Minister share with Parliament when the date range released last month by the Home Office Treasury regarding some members who can be unpaused be clarified, because this appears to continue discrimination within the police force?
Minister.
Referring to the work that's been taken forward, as I mentioned, under the UK Government's pension reforms in 2015, the MacLeod remedy, that work is progressing. A number of reasons have led to the delay on that. As I said, it's something that's affected all similar pension schemes across the UK. No member of the scheme will be disadvantaged as a consequence of that, because any payment is backdated and they receive interest payments on top of that, and the SPP has continued to communicate with members on that. If the members have got other technical aspects around about the issue that she wants to discuss further, I'm very happy to meet with her to delve into that with SPP in more detail.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes general questions. On Monday, I was honoured to represent the Parliament along with party leaders at a service at the National War Memorial at Edinburgh Castle to mark the 3rd anniversary of the war in Ukraine and to show our solidarity with all of those suffering as a result of this ongoing war. Before we move to First Minister's questions, I invite party leaders to make some remarks, and I call on the First Minister.
President Officer, peace is not gifted to us. It has to be nurtured, and sometimes, regrettably, it has to be hard fought for. So while Russia repeats the worst mistakes of the past, years into an unnecessary war, Ukraine calls on Europe to defend her interests and to support her fight for democracy and the rule of international law. That is why Scotland supports Ukrainian independence. That is why Scotland supports Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. That is why Scotland will always work with Ukraine towards the goal of absolute peace in Europe. At this moment of great uncertainty, let me be clear that Ukraine must sit at the table of any peace agreement. This is the only way to achieve a peace which not only delivers Ukraine from barbaric aggression, but a peace which protects Ukraine's heritage, her culture and her social and economic future. We have extended a warm welcome to Ukrainians who have sought refuge in our own country. That is the very least that we should be able to do. Today, as ever, Scotland stands with Ukraine.
Thank you. I now call on Russell Finlay.
Thank you. On Monday, it was my great privilege to attend the service at Edinburgh Castle to mark the 3rd anniversary of Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And I was moved by the sight of Ukrainian flags flying proudly over our capital city in solidarity with those who are suffering unimaginable bloodshed and horror. We remembered the countless innocent lives that have been lost in defence of their country and our shared values of freedom and democracy. And we should take pride in the United Kingdom's significant and unwavering support of Ukraine. We all want the war to end, but the people of Ukraine deserve this to be on their terms, not those of Vladimir Putin.
Thank you. I now call Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. For 1,099 days, the people of Ukraine have felt the full force of Russian aggression. 1,099 days of invasion, of bloodshed, of indiscriminate bombing, of drone attacks, of sheltering underground, of fear and heartbreak. But today, Ukraine still stands and is still strong. The front line of democracy remains resolute thanks to the bravery of Ukraine and its people. Scotland and the United Kingdom have reason to be proud for the role we have played in giving Ukraine the tools it needs to defend itself. And as the Prime Minister has made clear, nobody wants this bloodshed to continue. But as we seek an end to this war, there can be no discussion about Ukraine without Ukraine. The people of Ukraine must have long-term security. 1,099 days later, and for as long as it takes, we stand with Ukraine. We stand for peace and freedom in Europe and around the world.
Thank you. I call Lorna Slater.
Officer. Today, this Parliament recognises 3 years of Ukrainians standing strong in the face of Russian aggression. 3 years of immense suffering, displacement and loss of life. From the very beginning, Scotland has stood in solidarity with Ukraine, welcoming Ukrainians into their homes and communities, and I am proud that as a Parliament we are just as united in that support today. I want to see Europe and the UK standing strong behind Ukraine, its people and the virtues of democracy. I wish for peace for Ukraine with all my heart, but on their terms and with them at the table.
I call Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, at this moment and for every moment of these past 3 years, it is only the courage of the armed forces of Ukraine that has held back the menace of Russian expansionist tyranny. In recent weeks, much reference has been made to the similarities that exist between our time and the prelude to the Second World War, to appeasement and the rising tide of fascism. I have found myself thinking of the words of Winston Churchill used on the floor of the House of Commons in 1940 when he pledged to ride out the storm of war and to outlive the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. Presiding Officer, the fighting men and women of Ukraine have ridden the storm of war for years, but they are not alone. This Parliament stands with them, and so too does the nation that it serves. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes. Slava Ukraine. Heroim Slava.
Thank you. Our next item of business is First Minister's questions. And at question number 1, I call Russell Finlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland's Information Commissioner David Hamilton says that he's astonished at the sheer number of public bodies in our country, and I quote, "There are literally hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of public bodies, and I keep finding new ones." He describes, and again quoting, a hidden and complicated landscape across the public sector. This is not some random person venting on social media. He is the gatekeeper of all state-held information, the ultimate authority in deciding what information is made public. The Information Commissioner can't even work out how many public bodies there are. So if he even can't work out how big the SNP state has become, what chance do the paying public have?
First Minister.
Well, the Government has, over the course of its time in office, reduced the number of public bodies that we inherited, and we also take forward an agenda which ensures that we adequately consult with wider Scotland on the policy questions that we take forward. The Government obviously maintains a stringent approach to the management of public expenditure to ensure that we are constantly challenging to maximise value, and those considerations underpin the budget that I'm glad that Parliament passed on Tuesday.
Russell Finlay.
Well, the information told Parliament that he discusses the big state with the Auditor-General for Scotland. Mr Hamilton said that he doesn't, and I'm again quoting, think there's a map that explains it all, and that they play a game called Public Authority Bingo, in which they ask each other, have you heard of this one and have you heard of that one? The Auditor-General and the Information Commissioner, the two most powerful civil servants tasked with keeping the state in check, are hitting a brick wall of SNP secrecy. So will the First Minister give them and all of us a bingo call by shouting out the exact number of public bodies there are in Scotland?
First Minister.
On the 1st of December 2024, there were 131 public bodies in Scotland under our control. In 2007, when the government came to office, there were 199. So there's the answers that Mr Finlay's looking for. And by the way, as a point of information, I thought Parliament was here to hold the government to account.
Russell Finlay.
I thought he might come up with the 131 number, but the First Minister, a cursory check would inform him that he's missed out at least another 75 public sector organisations. And it's truly farcical that public servants in charge of information and financial transparency can't get the answers that they and the public deserve. The size of the bloated SNP state is out of control and shrouded in secrecy. This is costing taxpayers a fortune and reducing funding for the front line. The SNP are failing to deliver efficient and effective public services, and this must change. So I'm going to make a suggestion to John Swinney. Will he bring in a credible business leader from outside his government to sort this out?
First Minister.
Well, I take these issues very seriously, and throughout my time as Finance Minister, I would be regularly attacked in this Parliament for setting exacting efficiency standards on public sector budgets on an annual basis, and the result of that was that we released significant value for investment in the public finances. Now, I'm just struggling to remember about the Police Scotland reforms, for example. But the Police Scotland reforms, and I'm going to say this, I might be wrong. If I'm wrong, I'll correct it. It must Finlay can correct the record, actually. I think the Conservatives opposed us on Police Scotland. They did. Well, my good and dear friend Christine Graham is not for the first time in my life coming to my rescue. The Conservatives opposed the formation of Police Scotland, one of the biggest reforms of the public sector landscape, which delivered £200 million in savings. And what we've been treated to today is the usual hypocrisy from Russell Finlay.
Russell Finlay.
I'm setting out ways to save taxpayers' money, while John Swinney is only ever intent on taking more of it. He's got no respect for public finances. Just take a look at his dismal record. The truth is, they've created far too many talking shops that achieve nothing. They've published 800 plans and strategies which no one reads, and nobody even knows how many SNP state agencies there are, not even the Auditor-General and the Information Commissioner. And this year's SNP budget will again hammer working Scots by raising taxes, which this lot will then squander on yet more nonsense. Isn't it basic common sense for John Swinney to start saving taxpayers' money by cutting quangos and funding the front line instead?
First Minister.
Well, we've just passed a budget which is funding the front line, and Russell Finlay didn't vote for it, so I don't know what on earth Russell Finlay is complaining about. And we've delivered just one example of a public service reform that we've delivered, which has leveraged out £200 million in savings, and Russell Finlay and the Conservatives opposed that. So it's all talk and no action from the Conservatives. And the programmes that have been taken forward by my Minister for Public Finance, Ivan McKee, are securing savings expected to reach up to £280 million over a two-year period by the end of 24-25, with further projected savings of nearly £300 million over the following two financial years to the end of 26-27. So I take deadly seriously the management of public expenditure, because I want to make sure as much money is available to support frontline services as is possible. The difference between me and Russell Finlay is I'm prepared to vote for a budget to support the front line. He's not.
Question number 2, Anna Sarwar.
Almost a decade ago, when John Swinney was Education Secretary, he said the defining mission of the government was education. On Tuesday, it was revealed that under the SNP, the attainment in Scotland's schools is declining across the board, and shamefully, outcomes for young working-class Scots are getting worse compared to those from wealthier backgrounds. And today, the Auditor-General said the SNP had failed to properly provide the support for those pupils with additional support needs. He said the Scottish Government has failed to plan effectively, and went on to say it is unclear whether all Scotland's children's right to have an education that fully develops their personality, talents and abilities is being met. Isn't it the case that Scottish education, once the envy of the world, is going in the wrong direction under the SNP?
First Minister.
I'm always prepared to listen to reports from the Auditor-General and to consider the implications for government and for local authorities, because local authorities are responsible for the delivery of education in our country. So we will take those issues seriously and respond accordingly. I think it's important that I reassure members of the public about the progress that's been made on closing the attainment gap. The overall poverty-related attainment gap has reduced by 60% since 2009-10 under this government. The poverty-related attainment gap between young people from the most and least deprived areas meeting standards in literacy is at a record low in primary schools at 20.1%, and the attainment gap has reached record lows between secondary pupils achieving third level in both literacy and numeracy at 12.7 and 12 percentage points respectively. And in relation to the additional support for learning, which I accept the absolute necessity to make sure that good outcomes are achieved for young people, the attainment gap between school pupils with additional support needs and those without has reduced by almost half since 2009-10, 45.3% to 23.1%. Now, I accept there is more that needs to be done, but important and substantial progress has been made on closing the attainment gap, and that is good for children and young people in our country.
Anna Sarwar.
John Swinney was the person tasked with improving Scottish education, and he has failed. Just last year, 42.6% of pupils left school without a single higher or equivalent. That's almost 24,000 young people. 16.5% left school without a single National 5 or equivalent. That's over 9,000 children. And 1,300 young people left school without the most basic of qualifications. The future of every single one of these children should matter. And, Presiding Officer, let's not forget it was John Swinney who downgraded the exam results of working-class kids during the pandemic. And now, as First Minister, he is overseeing the betrayal of young Scots with the attainment gap widening. Why is this SNP government letting down a generation of young Scots?
First Minister.
I'm afraid Mr Sarwar is going to have to learn to adapt his questions based on the information that I put on the record. So let me repeat the information that I put on the record, Presiding Officer.
Members.
The overall poverty-related attainment gap has reduced by 60% since 2009-10 in the face of unremitting austerity from the United Kingdom Government. So progress is being made. There is an improvement in the outcomes for young people over that period. Mr Sarwar talked about the outcomes for young people leaving school. The percentage of young people in a positive destination 3 months after leaving school is 95.7%, the second highest since records began. So I'm afraid Mr Sarwar has to... I accept there is work to be done, but Mr Sarwar has to accept the evidence I'm putting on the record that as a consequence of the investment that this government has made, we are making progress in improving outcomes for young people and in closing the attainment gap, and Parliament should support that endeavour.
Anna Sarwar.
This is a government that includes a zero-hour contract or voluntary work as a positive destination for young Scots. And I literally quoted 42.6% of pupils left school last year without a single higher or equivalent. And it's interesting the First Minister didn't respond to that statistic. Almost 45% of young people leaving without a single higher in our schools. And teachers have been warning about this for years. And education expert Professor Lindsay Patterson said this morning, the Scottish Government has never had a coherent strategy for dealing with the educational effects of poverty. John Swinney's report card is woeful. Attainment down across the board, more pupils leaving school with no qualifications, fewer additional support need teachers. Our classrooms should be places for learning, growing and flourishing. And the promise I make is that as First Minister, I will make sure every young Scot can reach their potential. That's why we will agree new Scottish industry standards so that young people can see the future opportunities that their school subjects and qualifications will give them. That's the new direction we offer. So after nearly 2 decades, the SNP have nobody else to blame for the damage done to Scotland's education system. So isn't it clear that the SNP's defining mission is now their defining failure?
First Minister.
Mr Sarwar might have conjured up that script before he actually asked me any questions, but I have refuted the detail that he's put on the record because we are making progress in closing the attainment gap, as I recounted to Mr Sarwar a second ago. The attainment gap under this government has reduced by 60% since 2009-10, and I am absolutely determined to improve outcomes for young people. Why are we doing that? Well, we're doing that because this was the government that put the investment in to give children the best start in life by the expansion of early learning and childcare. This government has put the money in place to support the improvement in the lives of young people living in poverty by the Scottish Child Payment. Originally set at £5, now £26.70 to every eligible child, helping to lift hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty. It's why in Scotland we are the only part of the United Kingdom where it is projected that poverty amongst children will fall when it will rise in every other part of the United Kingdom under the stewardship in England and in Wales of the Labour Party. So I would say to people in Scotland, look at what the SNP has delivered to improve the opportunities and the life chances of the children and young people of Scotland. And look at what a Labour government does, that goes into office promising to reduce fuel bills for individuals in our country, and they go up. That's what Labour deliver. They deliver broken promises to the people of Scotland, and Mr Sarwar will be no different.
Question number 3, Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when the Cabinet will next meet.
First Minister.
Next meet on Tuesday.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Presiding Officer, Winifred was an active 87-year-old until she fell and broke her hip. Her family say that they are aghast at what happened next. In the weeks that followed, she experienced a 12-hour wait in accident and emergency, an unsafe discharge, a 9-hour wait for an ambulance to take her back to hospital, and yet another 12-hour wait in A&E. And Winifred is not alone. These waits for emergency care have skyrocketed since the SNP came to power. New research we are publishing today shows that more than 12,000 people aged over 85 waited longer than 12 hours in Scotland's A&E departments last year. So can I ask the First Minister, what does he have to say to Winifred, to her family and the thousands of others like them so abjectly failed by his government?
First Minister.
President, the first thing I want to say is that I'm sorry to Winifred and to her family for the experience that they have had. As I have recounted on a number of occasions to Parliament, the Health Service faces extraordinary pressures as a consequence of the demand for assistance that there is in our healthcare system. I don't know the moment at which this incident happened, but if Mr Cole-Hamilton will furnish me with the details, I will respond to that in full. But as he knows, as I've recounted to Parliament, over the winter period, we've had extraordinary pressure on our healthcare system as a consequence of flu. What I can reassure Mr Cole-Hamilton about is that on the latest data available, 12-hour waits in accident emergency, which are completely unacceptable, are falling. 8-hour waits are falling, still completely unacceptable, but they are falling. As we begin to get on top of the implications of that wave of demand that the healthcare system has faced. In relation to delayed discharge, the Government is working very closely with health and social care partnerships to reduce the level of delayed discharge so that individuals are properly supported in their homes. And as a consequence of the agreement we managed to secure with the Liberal Democrats around the budget Local authorities will be able to benefit from more resources at their disposal to invest in social care to support individuals like Winifred, and the Health Service will obviously have more resources as a consequence of the budget agreement that we reached.
Thank you. Question number 4, Michael Matheson.
To ask the First Minister what assessment the Scottish Government has made of the recent study by the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit regarding the contribution of the net zero sector to the UK and Scotland's economy.
First Minister.
President Officer, I very much welcome this report, which clearly sets out the importance of net zero sectors to our economy in Scotland. Our green economy is thriving and has grown by over 20% in the last 2 years, generating over £9 billion in GVA and supporting over 100,000 full-time equivalent jobs. This is faster growth than across the United Kingdom. This undoubtedly shows that the transition to net zero is driving progress towards our climate ambitions at the same time as delivering economic benefits.
Michael Matheson.
I'm grateful to the First Minister for his response, and he rightly highlights that this report demonstrates the progress towards net zero is having a positive benefit, with an increasing number of companies operating in the sector, increasing steadily year on year, creating more jobs and supporting our local economies and local communities. The progress highlighted in the report, however, does fly in the face of those who would seek to undermine the importance of achieving net zero, not just for our environment but also for our economy, with some even going so far as to deny there is a need to achieve net zero. Therefore, does the First Minister agree with me that achieving net zero is critical to a future sustainable Scotland? And can he outline how he will ensure that the Scottish Government will ensure that my constituents, especially those working in areas such as the Grangemouth industrial cluster, will benefit from the growth of this sector in the months and years ahead?
First Minister.
First of all, let me make clear that I believe there is an absolute necessity and imperative for us to take climate action. It was the subject of a speech I made last week, in which I wanted to address the understandable unease that Mr Matheson puts to me about voices who are saying we no longer need to take the climate action. All of the evidence demonstrates we have got to do that, and to do it urgently. I think this report helps us to win the argument that there is economic opportunity from the transition to net zero, which again is very welcome. And in relation to Mr Matheson's local point, in relation to his own constituents who are affected by Grangemouth, I set out in a statement to Parliament last week the investment of £25 million of additional resources that the Scottish Government is making available, and I welcome the announcement the Prime Minister made on Sunday of the opening up of £200 million from the National Wealth Fund. And we will work, and I give Mr Matheson this assurance, we will work closely with the workforce in Grangemouth to advance on all of these issues.
Thank you. Douglas Lumsden.
Presiding Officer, with the growth in renewable energy, we're also seeing a huge rise in the number of battery storage sites right across Scotland, with over 300 in the planning system. And last week we had a fire at one of these sites at Rothieu-Norman, and constituents are concerned at the fire and pollution risks at these sites. And at committee this week, SEPA admitted that they are, and I quote, concerned about the risk associated with battery energy storage systems, and admitted there's currently no regulatory framework or even a timescale on when a legislative change might happen. First Minister, these can be dangerous systems. So will the Government take action to regulate the battery storage industry before a major incident occurs?
First Minister.
I recognise the importance of the points that Mr Lumsden puts to me. I would imagine, although I'll have to go and scrutinise this, that the regulatory oversight on these questions is likely to be a reserved issue, because I would imagine the proximity of the Health and Safety Executive will be critical in all of this. But I will explore the point that Mr Lumsden puts to me and write to him to set out the definitive answer. But I do think that, regardless of where the responsibility lies, we must have a safe approach to the delivery of any battery storage plants. These are critical to the transition to net zero, but members of the public are entitled to reassurance about safety, and I'll give Mr Lumsden the definitive response that he looks for in writing.
Sarah Boyack.
The ECIU report actually highlighted statistics showing Scotland's growth in net zero employment contributions has slowed down and is now growing more slowly than every other region of the UK. So can the First Minister tell us why net zero employment growth in Scotland is so much slower when our natural resources are potentially greater, and what his plans are to deliver the jobs and training urgently needed to decarbonise our transport, our homes and buildings and our land?
First Minister.
Well, I indicated in my answer that Scotland's net zero economy supports 100,700 full-time equivalent jobs. This has grown by 19.5% since 2022, and the UK growth has been 15.2%. So Scotland's, on the data I've got in front of me, Scotland's job growth in net zero has grown faster than the rest of the United Kingdom. So I'm all for encouraging employment growth in net zero. We're taking decisions. I was up in Nig a few weeks ago at Sumitomo. I've got other visits in the north of Scotland next week where I'll be looking at other renewable energy developments. I'm all for it. And the government is, of course, the government put in place in the budget on Tuesday £150 million of additional resources on renewables development. Unfortunately, it was just one of the many issues that Sarah Boyack wasn't able to bring herself to vote for on Tuesday.
Question number 5, Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to support farmers responding to threats to livestock from disease.
First Minister.
Officer, there are an unusually high number of threats being faced by farmers at the moment, including avian influenza, blue tongue, foot and mouth disease and Schmallenberg. Supporting farmers and producers is a key concern, and we are working with industry to guard against these threats. The Scottish Government has robust and regularly exercised contingency plans and a proven track record in responding effectively to notifiable diseases. We are asking farmers to remain vigilant and to discuss any concerns with their vet and to report suspicion of notifiable disease immediately to the Animal and Plant Health Agency. The Scottish Government continues to work closely with other nations in the United Kingdom to monitor and assess the risks and prevent incursions of disease.
Brian Whittle.
Can I thank the First Minister for that answer? I think farmers do not have their problems to seek and are continuing to feel the financial squeeze from both the UK Labour Government's unfair family farm tax and the SNP Scottish Government's failure to deliver the rural support plan on time. As lambing and calving season are now upon us, they fear they may be facing further risks to the viability of their businesses in the form of biosecurity threats. Recently, a farmer in Ayrshire reported losing 92 of the 152 lambs due to Schmallenberg virus infection, a virus spread by the same disease vector as blue tongue virus. In the face of this, can I ask the First Minister what considerations his government has given to supporting the provision of Schmallenberg vaccine as the numbers of affected farms rise? How are these reports impacting disease surveillance of blue tongue virus, and what additional support is available to help farmers deal with the financial impact?
First Minister.
So obviously, I share Mr Whittle's concern about the sustainability of farming as a consequence of the inheritance tax changes. I've made that comment publicly before. And the Government, of course, has put in place a financial settlement of over £600 million for the farming sector, which has been allocated in the budget process, which, again, I would gently remind Mr Whittle he was unable to support on Tuesday. So we're putting financial support in place for the farming industry. This Government fulfils its commitments to farmers. Now, I've seen the news reports that Mr Whittle refers to, and I'm obviously very concerned about the implications for the individual farmer. Schmallenberg is non-notifiable in the UK or the EU, meaning there is no requirement for farmers to report suspicion of the disease because there is no control measures that government could take to prevent or eradicate the disease. I do, however, come back to the point I made earlier on, that we ask farmers, and I know I represent a large rural constituency, and I know the farming community takes this issue incredibly seriously, of reporting any concerns that they have to the relevant agencies. As a consequence of that vigilance, we have managed to stop outbreaks circulating of dangerous and damaging conditions, and we will continue to do so in the period ahead.
Thank you. Brief supplementary. Christine Graham.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I have, as Presiding Officer, we're aware many hill farmers in Midlothian, South Tweedale and Lauderdale, and they are, like everyone else, concerned at the spread of these viruses. And I hear what the First Minister had to say about measures in place to reduce the spread, because the Chief Veterinary Officer for Scotland has said it's inevitable that it will come. But what, and I heard what was said about Schmallenberg and how it's not notifiable. So what measures are in place across Europe, importing from Europe, not just in the UK, to try to reduce the spread of, let's say, Bluetooth?
Well, on the question of blue tongue, we already undertake routine blue tongue testing before and after movements of susceptible imported animals to ensure they do not introduce disease into this country. So that, I hope, provides Christine Graham with some reassurance that there is cross-border cooperation in this respect. In terms of vaccine provision, we currently do not allow vaccination for blue tongue serotype 3 in Scotland, which is a position supported by key Scottish industry organisations. But as I come back to the point I put on the record to Mr Whittle, that we do encourage farmers to advise their vets of any issues, and the Chief Veterinary Officer engages on these questions. The Rural Affairs Secretary updated Cabinet about these questions on Tuesday and will continue to do so.
Question number 6, Mark Ruskell.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister how the Scottish Government will protect the lives of racing greyhounds.
First Minister.
So the Government is committed to ensuring the welfare of all animals. The Government introduced the powers in the Animals and Wildlife Scotland Act 2020 to increase maximum sentences and fines for serious animal welfare offences. We also introduced provisions of the Animal Health and Welfare Scotland Act 2006, which offers significant and important safeguards for the welfare of all animals, including greyhounds. I'm aware of Mr Ruskell's proposed Members' Bill to prohibit greyhound racing in Scotland. I can assure him this Government will give full and careful consideration to the details of his bill when it is tabled.
Mark Ruskell.
So, can I thank the First Minister for that response and the summary of existing legislation, but I would ask him to reflect personally on the fact that hundreds of greyhounds are killed across the UK every year, thousands are injured, and that these deaths and injuries are happening at licensed tracks. So it's quite clear that licensing won't protect the dogs and that we shouldn't be licensing animal cruelty as a nation. So will the First Minister work closer with me and now the Welsh Government in rejecting licensing of greyhounds racing and phasing out greyhound racing to protect the dogs?
First Minister.
Sir, I'm aware of the developments in Wales, and I'm very happy for officials and ministers to engage in dialogue with Mr Ruskell on these questions. We will engage with we're very happy to engage with our Welsh counterparts to explore the decision-making that they have taken, and I understand the importance of the point that Mr Ruskell puts to me, and will happily engage with him on that question.
Thank you. We move to general and constituency supplementaries. If we're all concise, more members will have an opportunity, and I call Colette Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Sir Keir Starmer in the Labour manifesto committed to restore development spending to 0.7% gross national income. And just 3 weeks ago, Foreign Secretary cautioned that Trump's foreign aid cuts could be a big strategic mistake. This week, Labour has U-turned and announced major cuts to UK foreign aid. Does the Foreign Minister share my concern about the UK Government stepping away from global leadership on aid, and does he agree that if the UK Labour Government is looking to save cash, it could scrap the planned move of FCDO from East Kilbride in my constituency to Glasgow?
Sorry, Ms Stevenson, I believe you may have mentioned your constituency at the end of that question, but I will allow the First Minister to address that point specifically, but I would remind all members that we are here to discuss matters for which the Scottish Government has responsibility. First Minister.
So, obviously, I recognise the importance of employment in the East Kilbride constituency of my colleague Colette Stevenson that comes from the FCDO. There are outstanding plans to change the location of those employees, and I understand the concern that this is to the local member. And if there are any representations she wishes the government to make, we will happily do so on her behalf.
Thank you. Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Sunday Post revealed a legal loophole is denying answers to Scots families when their loved ones die abroad. Confusion over ordinary residence means that since 2016, repatriated bodies no longer get a fatal accident inquiry. Families like those of Aberdeen's David Cornock, who died in Thailand in 2019 and denied closure while his children were made homeless because the insurance wouldn't pay out. Now, this government's been aware of this for years, but hasn't fixed it. So will the government urgently review and resolve this situation before any more families have to suffer?
First Minister.
I will look at this particular issue. I know that my colleagues, various colleagues have raised this issue before, and I understand the concern that this issue will raise to families of those who are affected, and I will explore the issues and determine if there is further action that the government can take.
Thank you. Martin Whitfield.
Presiding Officer, last week there was no secure accommodation available in the network in Scotland. Today there is just one bed. On the 20th of February, the Children and Young People's Commissioner for Scotland wrote to the Minister to say, "I've been told that instead of placement in safe therapeutic environments with integrated education and mental health support, that is our secure accommodation network, children have instead had to be placed in what has been described to me, the Commissioner, as, quote, cobbled together provision. Is it right, under your government, that the most vulnerable children in Scotland are relying on cobbled together provision?"
Always through the chair, please. First Minister.
No, I don't think it is. And the government, obviously there's been legislative change which is absolutely the right thing to do to stop the incarceration of young people in Polmont, so they cannot be accommodated in prison. That puts more strain onto the secure system, and the Cabinet is actively discussing what measures the government needs to take to boost the scale and the capacity of the secure estate to ensure that the type of flexibility that was available, or capacity that was available when young people were incarcerated in Polmont, can also be available in the secure estate, because we must be able to provide appropriate accommodation for young people for those judgments, and that work is actively underway at the present moment.
Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday, CalMac announced the reshuffle of its vessels and timetables due to exceptional issues, which caused a third of its large vessel fleet to be out of action or operate with a reduced capacity. The MV Clansman overhaul has been delayed, the MV Isle of Lewis will take an extra month, and the MV Isle of Mull is restricted to just 45 passengers. For most of last year, the MV Caledonian Isles was out of action, with its return now pushed back to the end of April, meaning no services out of Ardrossan for another 2 months. What reassurances can the First Minister give to island communities who now fear a summer of chaos?
First Minister.
So the CalMac faces an incredibly congested set of circumstances as a consequence of issues in the ferry fleet. Mr Gibson has narrated them. CalMac have undertaken planning work to ensure that routes can be serviced and essential services can be delivered. That will be kept under constant review to ensure that there is adequate support for lifeline services. There are, of course, new vessels that are scheduled to be delivered. We have the Glensannox now in operation. We have 4 other vessels that are due to join the fleet that are being constructed at the Chemry Yard, and the Glen Rosa is also to join the fleet. So the assurance I can give to Mr Gibson is that the expansion of capacity and the modernisation of capacity is underway. Mr Gibson also will be aware that in relation to Ardrossan, the Transport Secretary is taking has made a significant intervention to ensure the sustainability of routes out of Ardrossan in the years to come.
Thank you. Tim Eagle.
Thank you, First Minister. This is from a letter I received yesterday. When I was 11, I was a happy child. I had friends, I had a happy home, and I never found school a struggle. Shortly after my 12th birthday, I was sent to board away from home. I live on the Isle of Mull. This is an emotional letter from a local resident presiding officer regarding the future of the Isle of Mull Secondary School. Residents on the island are contacting me with deep concerns about the selection process for the site for the new school, where all islanders just want the council to listen and what's best for every child. There is far too much detail for me to get into now, but can I ask the First Minister if he, like me, believes it really is vital to ensure the community are at the centre of the decision-making process? And will the First Minister meet with islanders and myself and any other MSP who wishes to join, virtually or on the island, to listen to their story and help ensure the right decision is made?
First Minister.
I understand the significance of the issue, but this is exclusively a matter for the local authority. And well, I don't know why I'm being shouted at saying it's not. Education, perhaps I've got to just explain it, but education provision in Scotland is delivered by local authorities. And Argyll and Bute Council is the authority that is consulting on this section. Now, Mr Eagle and his colleagues are regularly accusing the government of centralising power in this country, and I'm simply pointing out that the issue he's complaining about is a matter for Argyll and Bute Council to consult upon. Now, on the question of consultation, I think, of course, there should be adequate community consultation. I'm not quite sure why I'm being shouted at by Rachel Hamilton, but I'm simply saying that if Argyll and Bute Council, I would advise and encourage to engage in consultation with the community to come to an agreed position. These are difficult issues, of course they are, and councils should engage properly with their communities.
Thank you. Paul Swinney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My constituent, Liam Robertson, has Parkinson's that is slowly taking away his independence and his quality of life, and the disease is no longer responding to his prescribed medication. However, his consultant has advised that a treatment called Produodopa could be successful in slowing his deterioration. And when I wrote to the Health Secretary, I was told it's up to individual health boards whether they prescribe this life-altering treatment or not. And NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde have told me that they will have to wait until care home applications are restored in order for the drug to be prescribed to him. It is critical that we break this impasse and get Mr Robertson the vital treatment he needs. So will the First Minister ask the Health Secretary to meet with me and Liam Robertson so we can ensure that he has access to Produodopa as soon as possible?
First Minister.
I'm very happy for the Health Secretary to meet with Mr Swinney and his constituents on this question. I'm not quite clear of the status of the drug. That obviously have a determination on what can be made available, but I'm very happy to encourage that discussion to take place in order to address the points that Mr Swinney puts to me.
Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On Tuesday, Ofgem announced that the energy price cap will rise by 6.4% in April, meaning that energy bills will rise for the third time under the Labour UK government. So despite their election to cut energy bills by £300, they have instead increased by £300. Citizens Advice Scotland have stated it has supported 9,000 folk with their energy needs, and the average energy debt is currently £2,500. Does the First Minister agree that this blatant hoodwinking of voters from Anasarwa's Westminster bosses is nothing short of disgraceful during this cost of living crisis, especially in Aberdeen, the energy capital of the world?
Sorry, First Minister, I think further to what I said earlier, we will go on to the next question, and I call Rachel Hamilton.
Presiding Officer, I'm absolutely delighted that after months of pressure from MSPs in the Borders, including my friend and colleague Bluetooth Christine Graham, we have finally seen the money, up to £5 million released from the Labour government to see a transformational extension of the Borders Rail and the feasibility study. Does the First Minister recognise how transformational this will be for my constituents and for the Borders economy?
First Minister.
Well, I'm a great supporter of the Borders Railway. I always have been, but I don't remember that always being the position of the Conservatives, or certainly maybe not all the Conservatives. I seem to remember and I'll again come to defer to my dear friend Christine Graham. I do remember that chap John Lamont not being that supportive of the Borders Railway. But on a serious note, I think the Borders Railway has been an absolutely unparalleled success. It's improved connectivity. It's a great addition to the Borders. I totally understand the aspiration to expand and extend the Borders Railway to cover other communities in the Borders, and I'm glad that that funding has been released to enable that to be explored.
Willie Rennie.
First Minister will have seen that Sanjeev Gupta-owned South Australian steel plant at Waihala has been placed into administration. This follows another subsidiary, Liberty Steel East Europe, being placed into administration late last year. Gupta's DL plant here has not been producing for months. The company hasn't published accounts for years, and there's an outstanding Scottish Government loan. Yet there's been silence from the Scottish Government. What is the First Minister doing to ensure a future for the workers at DL?
First Minister.
Well, obviously, the Government acted in 2016 to ensure that there was not a closure at DL, and we encourage and endorse the points that Mr Rennie puts to me about the importance of securing productive activity at DL. We are aware of the GFG financial issues. There are obviously scrutiny being undertaken by ministers about these issues, because Mr Rennie correctly points out that there are loan issues involved, and the Government is assiduously engaging on this question to make sure that the interests of the workforce and the financial interests of the Scottish Government are protected at all times.
Emma Roddick.
The Children and Young People's Commissioner has said that the Scottish Government's proposed changes on religious observance do not represent significant progress towards UNCRC compliance, as they do not include allowing young people to independently opt out of religious observance at school. Parents have always had the right to opt their children out, but pupils have no equivalent right, no matter their age, maturity or personal beliefs. In an increasingly secular and religiously diverse country, it is critical that young people of all faiths and none have their beliefs and choices respected at school. Is this something that the First Minister will consider?
First Minister.
So this is an issue that is the subject of active the consultation period closed on the 26th of January. There are a wide range of views on the topic, and ministers will obviously consider and decide on the way forward. We will consider all responses to the consultation and publish an analysis in due course, and at that point we will set out the steps that we will take forward to address the issues that are the subject of the consultation.
Thank you. That concludes First Minister's questions. The next item of business is a member's business debate in the name of Murdo Fraser, and there will now be a short suspension to allow those leaving the chamber and the gallery to do so.
Thank you. Could I please ask our guests in the gallery who are leaving the chamber to do so quickly and quietly, as we're now going back into session. And the next item of business is a member's business debate on motion 15739 in the name of Murdo Fraser on protection of park home residents. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Murdo Fraser to open the debate. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by thanking all members who signed my motion from across the chamber, allowing it to be debated this afternoon on what is an issue clearly of interest to many members. And can I start by paying tribute to SCOPRA, the Scottish Confederation of Park Home Residents Association, for the excellent campaigning and lobbying work they've done on behalf of their members, and in particular reference Gordon Morrison, who's the chair, who's in the gallery with us this afternoon. And then also acknowledge the work done by Colin Beattie, MSP, who previously chaired a cross-party group on park homes, of which I was a member, which was helpful in getting some changes done at that particular point. To start by putting the issue into a little bit of context, park homes are a growing component in the housing market in Scotland, with an estimated 100 park home residential sites across the country, being the home to more than 8,000 residents. A park home is what is effectively classed as a temporary structure, or what is sometimes better known as a chalet or a lodge, where the owner of the property pays a ground rent to lease the land on which the structure sits. These properties are not, however, insubstantial structures. The average cost of such homes varies between £90,000 and £250,000, and they provide a high standard of comfortable accommodation with all the amenities of a more permanent building. These park home developments tend to be situated in scenic rural areas, often with an attractive outlook, and have become a popular option, mainly for retirees or those looking to downsize, to be part of a community of like-minded individuals, to reduce their maintenance and energy costs, and don't have to worry about maintaining a large garden. And we're seeing more and more of these lodge developments spring up, and their existence allows larger family homes to come on the market and be available for those who need the additional accommodation. So park homes are a very positive development, but unfortunately there are a number of issues that have arisen impacting the purchasers of park homes, which has led me to the conclusion that the law around the purchase and occupancy of these properties needs to be updated and reviewed. So we have cases of disputes between park home purchasers and site owners going unresolved, residents feeling in some cases threatened and intimidated by unscrupulous developers. Unlike the purchase of a permanent residence, the acquisition of a park home does not involve a formal conveyance, and accordingly many purchasers do not involve solicitors in the purchase, even when parting with substantial sums of cash, a situation which can leave them vulnerable to being exploited. At present, the purchaser of a park home has the right to be given a written statement, which is a contract between the site owner and the resident and is enforceable in law by both parties. It will set out the details of the location and size of the pitch on which the home sits, the annual pitch fee which is payable, which typically rises each year in accordance with RPI, although I know the Scottish Government has plans to change that to CPI, and the rules of the park. And despite this requirement, in practice, we know that there are park home owners who are not given a written statement, or where its terms are not met by the site owner. One of the most concerning situations I have come across relates to the park home development at Bendicky, just outside Blairgowrie in Perthshire. In March 2022, Heritage Park Estates Limited was given planning consent for 43 lodges and 10 glamping pods on a former poultry farm development, with the planning consent making it clear that the units would be used for holiday accommodation only. In August 2023, the Advertising Standards Authority ruled that the site owners had misled the public into believing the homes could be used as permanent residences, and a number of individuals purchased them on that basis. Roy and Susan Robertson are a couple in precisely that situation. They sold their family home to purchase a park home at Bendicky Park, believing this would become somewhere they could spend their retirement. The properties there were advertised under the strapline, "Your dream home built your way." And a prominent bullet point in the sales material stated the park was open 365 days a year and made reference to the units being, and I quote, "homes," unquote. It was only after they parted with their funds did the Robertsons realise, too late, that the planning permission for the property restricted it only to holiday use. They, along with a number of other residents, have now been served with planning enforcement notices, which require them to find a permanent residence elsewhere, failing which they will face eviction. As might be imagined, this is an extremely distressing situation for those affected, leaving them to have to apply to the local council for accommodation elsewhere and be treated as potentially homeless. Now, I have raised this issue with Perth and Ross Council and with Trading Standards. Trading Standards were pursuing it with the company that did the development. That company has now gone into liquidation and has been transferred to another property, of course, which cannot be pursued, which is very unfortunate. I see Graham Day wanting to make an intervention. I'll give way.
Graham Day. Can I appreciate Mother Fraser take the intervention, also for raising this very, very important issue in Parliament. I don't disagree with the thrust of what he's saying at all, but I wonder if he would agree with me that in some instances local authorities could be making more active use of existing powers that they have at their disposal. I'm thinking, for example, of the fit and proper person test in relation to those operating these sites, because that would afford better protection for park homeowners, at least in the short term.
Murdo Fraser.
Can I thank Graham Day for that intervention? I think he makes a very reasonable point about the enforcement of existing powers. I would say in relation to Benedictine Park, that was not treated as a caravan site, and therefore the fit and proper person test did not apply in that particular case. But there are other cases where it will apply, and that is where local authorities have a legitimate role to intervene, and in some cases could be doing that more energetically. So I think that's a reasonable point. Let me just raise briefly, Presiding Officer, other concerns that have been raised with me affecting park home residents. Typically, utility costs are paid centrally by the site owner and billed back to the tenants, giving rise to concerns about additional charges and profiteering. In some cases, residents who wish to alter or extend their homes or carry out landscaping work, such as installing decking or patios, are only permitted to have this done by the authorised contractor of the site owner, and that done, therefore, at inflated cost. And where a park owner sells their property, typically 10% of the sale price is taken by the site owner as a fee. And residents who are elderly or have a disability are not eligible for local authority grants for improvements and adaptations because park homes are not treated as permanent buildings. Now, as the Minister knows, I've put forward amendments to the Housing Bill, which we're meeting to discuss next week. I think it would be very reasonable to extend the existing law on adaptations to allow those living in a park home, which is their permanent residence, to be eligible for these grants. And the other important amendment which I would like to progress is in relation to the resolution of disputes, because at the moment, where park homeowners are in dispute with the site owner, their only remedy is to go to the Sheriff Court. And as we know, that's a very expensive and bureaucratic process. Civil legal aid is almost impossible to achieve, and trying to find lawyers with a knowledge and specialisation in this area is immensely difficult, which is why SCOPRA have been pushing for the resolution of disputes to be moved to the first-tier tribunal, which deals with other housing issues which would not require the same level of expense nor the involvement necessarily of solicitors, and that's something I've put forward as an amendment. So I've had a very good engagement with the Minister, as has SCOPRA in the past. I know he's very sympathetic to some of the concerns that have been raised. And I hope that this members' debate will see a recognition by the Scottish Government of the need for changes in the law in this area to ensure, Presiding Officer, we protect some of the most vulnerable in our society. And I move the motion in my name.
Thank you, Mr Fraser. Could I please remind all members who are seeking to speak in the debate to check that they have in fact pressed the request to speak button. And could I now call Colin Beattie to be followed by Oliver Mdell. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be speaking today to address an issue that affects many of my constituents in Midlothian, North and Musselburgh, and thousands more across Scotland, our park home residents, many of whom are not receiving the support they deserve, and I thank Murdo Fraser for bringing this motion forward for debate. Back in 2011, when I was first elected, I convened the cross-party group on park homes, which was formed to manage changes to legislation to correct anomalies which were seen as being unfair and unreasonable to residents. This was achieved successfully, but now it seems that these changes did not go far enough, and both legislation and enforcement needs to be revisited. Many of my constituents residing in park homes are elderly or retired and are almost consistently treated unfairly by their site owners. I've already said that the Scottish Government has taken steps to improve conditions for park home residents, but I believe more can and should be done to provide further protections for this vulnerable group. We're all too aware of the energy crisis that's gripped our constituents' lives as prices continue to rise. It's hard to believe that some park home residents do not have fair and transparent access to utilities which they pay for. If utilities are purchased from the site owner as part of their written agreement, then no specific charges can be identified. This even bypasses Ofgem's maximum price limits, which are there to protect customers. This lack of transparency leaves park home residents open to exploitation. A simple step our government could take is ensuring residents have clarity and openness in how their utility bills are calculated. Site owners must be constrained from profiteering from their residents' energy use. Unfortunately, this is not the only common issue that residents face. The restrictions to qualify for home adaptations grants has left many in the most appalling circumstances. I'd like to share the story of one constituent who was given the most heartbreaking news. They had just had their second leg amputated, and as they lived in a mobile home, they did not qualify for financial help to install home adaptations. This is per the Housing Scotland Act, which states any home which isn't a permanent structure does not qualify. It's outrageous that anyone can be left trapped and isolated following a life-altering illness, and we must close this glaring loophole. Following this correspondence, I reached out to the Scottish Government, who assured me they are conducting a review into the adaptation system. I look forward to the outcome of this review, and I hope it will bring welcome news to park residents across the country. It's also vital that park home residents are included in wider discussions. Their voices must be heard. Currently, this can be done via residents' associations that allow residents to organise and create dialogue with their site owners. And I was pleased to meet with the Scottish Federation of Park Home Residents Associations this morning, where we discussed the importance of this. Residents' associations are very important, and they can assist residents in creating their own associations. However, my constituents inform me that some site owners still refuse to consult with resident associations, and cooperation cannot be enforced. I would encourage the Scottish Government to investigate where the legislation can be tightened to ensure greater cooperation between site owners and residents. Simple mutual respect seems to be lacking. Deputy Presiding Officer, park home residents are not asking for special treatment. They're asking for fairness, stability and the ability to join their home without unnecessary hardship. By working together, we can ensure that every resident, every one of our constituents, can live with dignity and security. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Beattie. I now call Oliver Mundell to be followed by Faisal Chowdhury. Mr Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I start by paying tribute to my colleague Murdo Fraser for securing this important debate today and for shining a light on what is often an undervalued and overlooked part of Scotland's housing landscape. SCOPRA do a really great job, but they are working without the resource and on an entirely voluntary basis to make the case on behalf of thousands of residents. I was keen to speak in the debate myself from my constituency experience over the last 8.5 years to give the voice to the legitimate concerns of local residents of park homes who are often left without a voice or adequate mechanisms to address the unfairness and discrimination they face. And I'd say to the Minister, those concerns are such, I actually don't want to give a number of the specific examples today because people are in such fear of the relationship they have with park home owners and the control they have over their home. That wouldn't be acceptable in any other part of the housing landscape. And while over-regulation is something that concerns me in relation to so many other sectors, the situation here is quite the opposite. Too often the park home sector feels like the Wild West, where the normal rules don't apply. And while I know that there are some diligent site owners out there that are doing the right thing, too many operate to a standard that is unacceptable. And they have identified this as a weak area in housing policy, where they can exploit vulnerable people, often older and disabled people, and use them as a cash cow. And I'm deeply troubled by the charges imposed, as Colin Beattie's mentioned, for electricity usage, and the lack of transparency around how these costs are calculated, and the inability of residents to control these costs. How can it be right that households who are among some of the most vulnerable, and many, as Murdo Fraser have said, have moved specifically to try and make their home more affordable, be totally excluded from the consumer protections that the rest of us enjoy? Equally, I've seen a number of issues with things like water pressure on sites, again, where there's no oversight. And there are the well-known and well-rehearsed issues around exploitative rates for changing ownership and the excessive and inflated site fees. All too often, park home owners feel like they are being treated like second-class citizens, and they're not, as other members have mentioned, given the full facts before signing on the dotted line. But, Presiding Officer, it's not just site owners themselves who give rise to concern. Local authorities, as has already been referenced, are not doing their bit and too often take a hands-off approach when it comes to their statutory and other duties in relation to these sites. In my experience, they often opt for the path of least resistance rather than stand up for local residents, adopting a tick box approach to site licensing and showing little interest when it comes to ensuring that site designs are fit for purpose. How can it be right that roads and planning officials have such limited powers to root out bad practice in this space? How can sizeable residential developments be allowed to be built and operated without proper roads, drainage and lighting? Then we come on to another area of bad practice that's already been referenced, the mis-selling of homes on non-residential sites. I first became aware of the scale of this issue during COVID, when many non-residential sites were asked to close in line with regulations, and my inbox was flooded with people being asked to move out of what they considered to be their main residence to go to other homes that didn't exist. And thankfully, the Scottish Government stepped in that instance, but I think there is a need for a more serious rethink with regards to the prevalence of this practice. Local authorities shouldn't be collecting council tax, registering people to vote and providing other services to these individuals on the one hand, and then claim to not know about them on the other. And as I close, Presiding Officer, I want to use this opportunity to urge the Minister to back Murdo Fraser's amendments and get behind cross-party efforts to make sure that people are treated with fairness and that they're given the same rights as other homeowners. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. I now call Faisal Chowdhury to be followed by Mark Ruskell. Mr Chowdhury.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I join members in congratulating Murdo Fraser on bringing this issue to the Chamber. And I welcome the opportunity to discuss it, as this is not an issue which has been raised frequently. The most recent estimation from the Scottish Confederation of Park Home Residents show there are around 8,500 people living in park homes and 100 parks in Scotland. Park homes can be used as both temporary holiday homes or as a permanent residence, which seems to be growing in recent years as an option for older people. The regulation of park home sites sits between permanent and temporary residents, and the different system of rents, ownership and licenses, which is outlined in the motion. Where residents own the home but not the land, can cause issues. For example, when you go on to the website of the Scottish Confederation of Park Home Residents Association, you will find tips for living in park homes, membership costs, and big red font that says warning notice, followed by a disclaimer telling those wanting to buy a holiday home to seek professional advice. This is because of the issues of residents being missold park homes on the false pretense that they were permanent dwellings, when in fact licensing designates them as a holiday homes. This has resulted in members of the public, often those newly retired, facing homelessness, despite being advertised a home for life. This holes in regulation also extends to energy, like in 2022, where park homes residents were initially left out of arrangements for government support on energy bills. and a separate scheme had to be established. And in recent years, following storms, residents have been without power for days on end. Some stating they feel like they are forgotten about by energy companies. I note the call in the motion for Park Homes residents to be given access to their housing adoptions. I am often contacted by constituents who struggle to get adopted housing in regular homes, and hear how, even for them, long waits are so worrying. So I cannot imagine how it must feel getting older and more frail, but have no access to housing adoptions due to regularity issues. Given these homes are being used as a permanent residence, similar to a rental property, it should be considered how adoptions can be made. I again congratulate Murdo Fraser on bringing this issue to the Chamber. I understand the Scottish Government is considering reviewing the licensing regime for park homes, and I look forward to hearing that Minister says to. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Chowdhury. I now call Mark Ruskell to be followed by Willie Rennie. Mr Ruskell.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. Can I thank Murdo Fraser for bringing forward this important issue to the Chamber. As a fellow representative of Mid-Scotland and Fife, I'm aware that park homes are a serious issue. It was very good to meet Gordon Morrison from Scotland at lunchtime and absolutely support further reforms in this area. It is clear that as we continue to face a housing crisis in Scotland, especially in rural Scotland, with increased demand for homes outstripping supply, that park homes will continue to meet a housing need. But I agree with Oliver Mundell. It really feels like a Wild West right now, Minister, in this area, and further reforms are really, really needed. And of course, housing is a fundamental human right, and everyone in Scotland deserves to have a warm, safe, secure home, including those living in park homes. But this doesn't seem to be the case at the moment. Perth and Kinross Council have issued 6 enforcement notices to lodge owners at Bendochi due to lodges being used as permanent residences when the original planning was not for this purpose. But these units were clearly advertised as homes, open year-round, arguably missold as permanent residences. And now, of course, those residents are facing uncertainty over their housing security due to those misleading adverts from a company that has now been liquidated. Yeah, I'll take Mr.
Oliver Mundell.
I thank the member for taking the intervention. Does he agree that it's wrong that often it's the individual residents who are more likely to face enforcement from local authorities than some of the park owners themselves?
Mark Ruskell.
Yes, I feel that there's an injustice there, a very clear injustice, and I think it's now up for the government to consider what amendments can be brought forward to the housing bill to really, and perhaps in other legislation as well, to rectify this. We talk a lot in this chamber about the needs of tenants. These are a particular type of tenants in Scotland that are facing a particular type of issues, and I think we need to understand it better and consider the options for reform. I think all these issues are really concerning, particularly for the most vulnerable residents of these parks. And I think, we've already heard examples of that. People who are in quite impossible situations, people often elderly, they maybe have a disability, and yet they're facing all of this stress. And I think, what's happened in Blairgowrie and elsewhere across Scotland really highlights that weakness in current legislation around park homes and ownership rights, and shows that unscrupulous companies can missell to consumers seemingly without any consequences. We've heard also about the issues around energy, and Deputy Presiding Officer and others will know that following Storm Owen, residents in Fordell Gardens in Fife were left without power for nearly 48 hours, but they found themselves ineligible for emergency aid from Scottish Power, which meant that residents had to either pay out of pocket for alternative accommodation or brave the cold until power was restored. And in this current cost of living crisis, this is completely unacceptable from the utility companies, and it really does beg the question why those residing in park homes are not, as a point of principle, point of justice here, not eligible for the same protection of those living in traditional dwellings. I do recognise that there is a really wider housing crisis in rural areas, and that there is arguably in some areas a real imbalance between holiday accommodation, private and social rent and owner occupation, and we really need to address this. I do see this in Perth and Kinross and elsewhere as well. Older people need the ability to downsize. They need the ability to live in smaller lodge-style units for rent with a surrounding supportive community, and possibly even co-housing as well, which brings a huge amount of benefits. That's the model that many people want and need, but it doesn't fit easily with the park home model, and it doesn't fit easily with existing planning policy as well. So I would ask the government to consider how we address that need, which is really at the heart of this issue. The need that park home residents and many people have in Scotland for a secure and peaceful place to retire free from anxiety. And I think the points that have been made about reform are well made, including perhaps the need for a statutory tribunal process. It's clear that these residents' rights are not being protected right now. Murdo Fraser's amendments to the Housing Bill give strong food for thought. We'll consider those, but I do look forward to working on a cross-party basis with other colleagues on this going forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr Roscoe. I now call Willie Rennie to be followed by Kenneth Gibson. Mr Rennie.
I think Oliver Mundell actually got it in a nub. He said about the owners of these caravans, of these mobile homes, are feeling the ones that they're vulnerable rather than the owners of the sites. And that's the crux of the problem here. I've got Ansmuir Park near Ladybank in my constituency, and I have to say that the owners of the site have been appalling. The maintenance of the site, issues around drainage and electricity have been frequently reported to me and my colleague Wendy Chamberlain. The site is split. It's a part holiday park, part residential park, but the poor relationship between the owners of the mobile homes and the owners of the site are long-standing. And I think it's important to call them out when they have got poor practice, because I think it's important that they improve their practice for the future, because it is a common feature, as we've heard today, about issues around about mis-selling. Is it a holiday home or is it a residence? Are people staying there all year round? Do they understand that before they purchase their home? Poor maintenance issues, issues about distribution of the statements. Frequently, they don't receive the statements. But also when there's power cuts, as Mark Ruskell has just alighted on, that they are considered as a commercial operator rather than individual residents, and the vulnerability of them is not highlighted within the power company's system. So I pay credit to Murdo Fraser, and I was really impressed with the authoritative way that he set out in great detail and knowledge about the issue, but also the clear dedication that he's got to try and resolve this issue. My experience going back to Ladybank was that we took this up with the local authority, and they were very passive. They were obviously under-resourced, which is a frequency with many local authorities, but they were passive in terms of the application of the licensing process, but also the original planning process as well. And I can understand they've got many challenges across the piece, but there's clearly incomplete powers, but also under-resourced licensing teams. And that's why I think Murdo Fraser's point is valid. I think we do need to be looking for a tribunal process to make sure there is a vehicle for residents to be able to, with an affordable price, to raise their concerns through an official channel, rather than the ramshackle processes that we have at present. I think that may drive changes in the wider sector. I think they may improve the process. Even if the tribunal is not used very often, it will bring some discipline and order into the application of this. And I understand this tribunal process does get utilised. The provision is there within England, and therefore I believe it should be applied here as well. So I think it's important. I think it's an incredibly important issue. A lot of people are feeling very vulnerable just now. There are many cases that I hear about where people are living in what are actually holiday homes, but they don't receive bin collections, they're not on the voting register, and they don't pay the council tax. Now, all of them are living on the edge of society. They think they're in their homes, but they are not officially in residential homes, and that's where the nub of the problem is. So I welcome the fact that the Government are doing a review of this sector. I think it needs radical change, because my experience so far is that it's wholly inadequate.
Thank you, Mr Rennie. I now call Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Dr Slumson. Mr Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I congratulate Murdo Fraser on securing this debate and thank the Scottish Confederation of Park Home Residents Associations for the briefing and many of the 70+ residents of Bruce Court, Willow Park and Millglen Lodges in my constituency who shared their views in advance of today's debate. Park homes are a growing and welcome component of our housing stock, and residents are typically retired looking to downsize and enjoy their retirement amongst like-minded people in a peaceful and attractive setting. But in the midst of a housing emergency, park homes can offer a low-cost way of expanding our housing stock while freeing up traditional brick and mortar homes for young families. Yet it's clear from today's debate that there is strong cross-party support that action needs to be implemented by the Scottish Government to protect park home owners. Residents own their home but not the land it's built on. They don't enjoy the rights owners or renters of brick and mortar homes have. Instead, any recourse in the event of a dispute is covered by consumer rights legislation or the park home licensing regime. The Mobile Homes Act 1983 requires that site owners must give the proposed park home occupier a written statement setting out the rights and responsibilities of both parties and other relevant information. Yet there is no standardisation of this important document. Some residents may not even have been given one, and there is no independent register of ownership. The licence fee doesn't cover the cost of any enforcement action, with the local authority instead having to recover this from the business operating a park home. I have constituents who believe this has held our local authority back from taking enforcement action where necessary, because site owners can refuse to communicate with residents' associations and individuals, making it difficult to resolve issues and causing significant frustration. There are also concerns about the lack of designated park managers to handle issues when site owners are away, leaving residents without support during emergencies. Scoffer and individual constituents question whether the fit and proper person test is weeding out unscrupulous site owners, and we've heard from colleagues of a number of alleged such owners. Site maintenance and safety is a common complaint, a prominent example being site owners allegedly failing to spread grit during cold weather, despite being asked to by vulnerable elderly residents. Such safety measures should be included in licensing conditions to ensure compliance. And as colleagues from across the chamber have touched on, adaptations to help people with disabilities exclude park homes as they are not a permanent structure. This despite more park home residents being older and therefore more likely to have mobility issues. Residents are concerned about the high cost of utilities like gas and electricity, which are often metered by park owners, and overcharging is alleged and residents feel vulnerable to exploitation. The Office of Gas and Electricity Markets limits the maximum price gas and electricity can be resold by site owners to residents. However, this limit doesn't apply when an inclusive charge is made for accommodation, for example, where a park home pitch fee includes all amenities or for the resale of liquefied petroleum gas. And when the previous UK Government awarded households £400 off their energy bills, park homes were excluded, and Patricia Gibson MP had to take the matter to the floor of the House of Commons. Residents have also difficulties adding an electric car charging point to their park homes. Regarding the 10% commission on sales, in days gone by, the site owner often assisted in selling a park home, acting much like an estate agent and partly justifying the fee. Park home managers consider this commission important, arguing for its role supporting site facilities. However, the near unanimous feedback from residents is negative, seeing this commission as more like a feudal levy. Often residents are opposed in principle, considering it unfair, or because they don't see a commensurate investment in site infrastructure. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is pledged to review site licensing before this session ends. I trust the Minister has taken on board concerns raised today by colleagues from across the chamber and will indeed progress changes to better protect residents, ensuring park homes remain a viable and attractive housing option for our elderly population.
Thank you, Mr Gibson. I call Douglas Lumsden to be followed by Douglas Ross. Mr Lumsden.
Thank you, President Officer. And can I thank Murdo Fraser for bringing this debate today? And I must admit that this was not a subject I was aware of until I signed Murdo Fraser's motion. I was then contacted by constituents in Aberdeenshire to meet with them, and I spent a morning with park home owners, understanding more of the issues that they faced. And I must say, what struck me when I went to visit was the sense of community. Everyone seemed to know everyone else in the park, and I guess that we shouldn't be surprised by that, because that's the whole idea of these parks, a community of like-minded individuals who have their own space in the countryside and also reduced maintenance. And the first point I want to make is that no one should think of these homes in any less way than a home made of bricks and mortar. We have heard of the term mobile homes in today's debate, but that does not do most of these homes justice. These homes do not move about. And to be covered by just mobile home legislation, I feel, is completely wrong. These homes are prefabricated homes, and the homeowners deserve the equivalent rights of other homeowners. I heard of homeowners not being given an adequate power supply to their homes, meaning things like the oven couldn't be on at the same time as the heating, but the site owner wouldn't do anything about it. I heard stories of the local council asking for improvements to be made at the site, but no evidence that the local council were actually checking that improvement conditions of a licence were being made, but instead taking the owner's word for it, no doubt due to limited budget, as we heard from Willie Rennie. I heard stories of site owners dismissing owners' concerns out of hand, and the owners only having a limited or expensive course of action. And, Presiding Officer, this is not good enough, and we cannot just ignore these legitimate concerns. And that is why, on the back of my meeting, I submitted a number of questions to the devolved government on this subject, and the response to these questions was pathetic, to say the least. I asked how residents' legal rights could be improved and what new regulations are being considered to enhance the protection of park home residents. I was told that the priority at present is work to change the basis of pitch fee uprating from RPI to CPI. That, Presiding Officer, is an embarrassment. The only thing the Minister thinks should change is the price rise mechanism. Nothing about improving legal rights and giving these residents more protection. I asked the Minister if there are any plans to establish an independent body to oversee and regulate park home sites. Again, the devolved government would rather turn a blind eye and do nothing. I asked the Government how the Scottish Government monitors and enforces compliance with existing regulations for park home sites. Presiding Officer, basically they don't. They just devolve all responsibility to our under-resourced local authorities. So this Government have declared a housing emergency, and park homes can play a big part in helping address this emergency. But we need proper protections and regulations in place. The ideal chance to have this put in place is the upcoming housing bill. This bill could put legal protections in place. This bill could set out a conflict resolution process. The bill could set out rights that park homeowners could expect from site owners. But the bill doesn't do any of that. It's like these homes and their owners just don't exist. And I urge the Minister to come with me and meet residents, and he can tell them why this devolved government doesn't care about their rights. He can tell them why he's content with turning a blind eye while there are rogue site operators operating. Minister, it's not too late. Listen to the issues, work with SCOFRA and make sure the housing bill works for all homeowners and end this discrimination against park home owners. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Lumsden. And I now call Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I too congratulate Murdo Fraser for securing today's debate and, as Willie Rennie said, opening the debate with great authority, with great knowledge of this subject, but also proposing solutions, because often government ministers accuse the opposition of complaining about things but not coming up with potential solutions to the issues. And I think we will discuss that later on with the Minister's response and hopefully next week with the housing bill. I will be focusing just on one point in my contribution, but I do want to acknowledge what others have said. Oliver Mundell was right to say that while there is a great interest in many of our constituencies and regions, and this is something that I've dealt with both in this chamber and in the UK Parliament, some people are concerned about their names being mentioned in these debates or even in correspondence to the Minister because of fear of repercussions from site owners. I would also say, and I'm not often the one that inserts balance into debates, there are some site owners who are very good. They are sometimes, sadly, in the minority of site owners, but I do have examples of some who went to great lengths during the recent cold snap we had in Murray, where the site owner and his staff were out clearing the pavements for elderly and disabled residents and ramps into their homes. So I think that is something that's important to get on record. But sadly, there is a significant number who are not acting in the best interests of the owners in their park. parks. And Murdo Fraser was also right to say these parks are extremely welcoming, as Douglas Lumsden pointed out as well. Many people come to Murray and the Highlands because they like the location, but also the sites themselves look extremely appealing from the outside, and you can understand why many people want to retire and move there. But the issue I want to focus on was briefly mentioned by Kenny Gibson, and that's about the Commission on sales of these properties. And I wrote to the Minister earlier this month, and I got a very prompt response from him. This is the issue where owners have to provide 10% commission to the site owners when they sell their property. And I accept that everyone knows this when they buy their property in the first place, but I do think we have to look to see if this is still now a reasonable cost for people to have to pay when they want to sell their home. Now, the Minister nodded when Kenny Gibson explained some of the reasons why this remains in place, but the Scottish Government did do a consultation in 2011 on this topic, and the split was right down the middle. The site owners and their representatives want the Commission to be maintained, and the homeowners oppose it. So at some point, we are not going to please both sides, but we have to decide, do we want to keep supporting the site owners who like this income, or do we want to respond more to the concerns of the homeowners? Because in that consultation, residents' group said the Commission is not directly related to the services provided. And I think this is an important point that came across in that consultation. It provides an incentive for unscrupulous site owners to harass residents into selling to maximise profits. That's why I think this is something that does need to be looked into. The Scottish Government previously did a review onto the wider impacts of this in 2013. Looking at the Spice briefing, I was surprised that the UK Parliament, looking at this now in England, haven't considered a change since I was born. So my entire life, the last change was in 1983 when the Commission went from 15% to 10%. Surely now, 12 years on from the Scottish Government's last review and over 4 decades since the UK Parliament looked at this, this is now the right time to consider if that Commission is still right and certainly if it should be set at 10%. Finally, Presiding Officer, can I say many of these members' business debates are often consensual, and I think we've had that today. And often we get from the Minister in his response that they will go away and look into things, but it can be weeks, months and sometimes years before action is taken. With this debate, we have a real opportunity in days, this time next week, to make some of the important changes that Murdo Fraser has suggested in his amendments, and I hope they will be considered positively by the Government. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Ross. I now call on the Minister, Paul McLennan, to respond to the debate. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I'd like to thank Mr Fraser for proposing this debate and members for their contributions. I think they've been very important and come forward with some of the solutions. Mr Fraser and I have met previously on this issue, and he's got my commitment, as well as meeting next week to talk about the bill, to meet again and to discuss that. I also met Scopra representatives as well. So you've got my commitment to ongoing discussions around about that. Residential mobile homes are, of course, an important housing option, and we've heard that from a few members saying that today, often for people who want to downsize and enjoy the lifestyle that a park home can offer in retirement. I think we've heard today that there's around about 100 sites in Scotland, and we've heard from many members that have got park homes in their own particular constituencies. So everyone has a right to safe and secure home, and we are committed, obviously, to making sure that those living in permanent mobile home sites have appropriate rights and protection. And I'll go into a wee bit more detail on some of these things that we're talking about. Obviously, it's been mentioned about the Mobile Homes Act 1983 and the Caravan Sites Act, which we kind of touched on as well, in 1968. The Mobile Homes Act 1983 set out implied terms that are automatically included in every contract between a permanent resident and a site owner. And one of the key things I've heard today, of course, is around about that written statement and how much that has been, I suppose, how definitively that's been between residents and tenants in that particular point. And the 1968 Act protects residents against eviction and harassment. The second is the licensing of mobile home site providers. And I think this is one of the key things that I've kind of heard all the way through this as well. And one of the key things I'm going to do on the back of this today is write to all local authorities to remind them of the powers that they have. And we've heard around about a fit and proper person being mentioned by a few times. Yeah, of course.
Oliver Mundell.
I thank the Minister for taking the intervention. One of my concerns is that a lot of this sits with environmental health at the moment, and there are good individuals working in that space, but they don't necessarily have the experience or knowledge, and they don't have housing expertise. Would the Minister look at that when he's contacting authorities?
Minister?
Yeah, I thank Mr Mundell for that question. I think that's a very valid point. It's just in terms of not just reminding them of what their obligations are, but in terms of how they're actually implementing that as well. It's fine having the powers, but to have the ability to implement them, and I think that's really important in terms of that. So the licensing thing, the licensing part of this is really, really important, and of course the licence system came in 2019. It provides local authorities with a range of powers that we've talked about to manage and ultimately revoke site licences to sites that have received planning permission for residential use. And I think a few members had discussed the issue, particularly about COVID, about homes that had been park homes that had been sold and obviously been misrepresented in terms that I remember a few cases where a few constituents came to me and were in the same situation. They were told they had to move out for a period of time and weren't aware of that right at the start. That hadn't been described at the start. So that's something we have to try and obviously make sure that we eradicate as well. So the Scottish Government provided model standards for local authorities to take into account in setting licensing conditions, and of course guidance to help in operation of licence systems and provide a degree of consistency. And the point that Mr Mundell made is a really important point in terms of that. And of course, in addition, mobile homes are a consumer purchase, and caravan park owners and operators are subject to consumer protection legislation. So it's important to keep protections under review, and we're taking action to do this. Again, we've talked around about pitch fee increases, and that's obviously regulated by the Mobile Homes Act 1983, so they do not increase by more than RPI. We've listened to concerns from residents that the gap between RPI and CPI has been greater in recent years, with the effect that pitch fees are growing faster than pensions income. The current housing bill, and I'll come on to that in a little second, includes a proposal to update inflation rate in the Mobile Homes Act 83 to CPI. As RPI is typically above CPI, we expect to see a slow rate of increase in pitch fees once the change comes into force. We're also committed to undertaking a post-implementation review of the residential homes site licensing scheme before the end of this Parliament, has been referred to by a few members as well. And I think what we've heard today in the debate, obviously, I think will be part of that discussion and how we take some of these problems forward. The review, of course, will consider the issues raised about the operation of the scheme to date. However, I think that I'm aware of obviously ongoing concerns by residents and obviously highlighted by members today. I've heard directly concerns from Scopra. I've also have a mobile home site in my own constituency. So I know there can be issues in sites, and what we've heard today is issues that I've heard from constituents in my own area. I've met with Scopra before, and I said happy to meet with Scopra and Mr Fraser or anybody else kind of going forward out with the bill discussions that we've had. There's just a few specific points that I want to kind of come in and address at that moment. Colin Beattie, I want to thank him for his work that he's carried out before in terms of that. He mentioned around about adaptations and obviously around about Ofgem. And I'm going to come and just kind of summarise some of these issues as well. Graham Day obviously mentioned about local authorities and their role in terms of that as well. Oliver Mundell obviously talked about site licensing and about mis-selling. And again, I'll come on to the site licensing. Faisal Chowdhury talked around about, I think, talking about some of the issues around about storms and what's happened again that. And again, I'll touch on what we're kind of looking at in terms of that as well. And I thank other members, obviously, for the points that they've raised. But I'll kind of come on to more as the points in terms of that. There are specific few points, I think, that were mentioned that. In terms of, obviously, the licence scheme, I've talked around about what we're planning to do that. One of the key things as well is obviously around about the energy. So I'm going to contact, one of the actions I'm going to take away today is obviously contact Ofgem around about that. There are certain rules and regulations around about that the site licenses, site owners should be operating to in terms of that. So that's something I'm going to take away and write to Ofgem, and happy to share with Mr Fraser on the back of that also going forward. I think that's really important. So there is guidance from Ofgem in that particular time around about site owners only selling at a price paid per unit of energy, and obviously the standing charge. So site owners cannot profit from charges made to residents. So obviously that's something I'm going to write to Ofgem in terms of that going forward today. I think there's a few other things just I want to mention as well. We talked about adaptations. Local authorities have a duty to ensure the needs of disabled residents, whatever their housing circumstances, are met and offer to support under the provisions of the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act 1970. We plan to take a review, as has been mentioned, of the current housing adaptation system, which will make recommendations on how best to improve and streamline the system and better target resources. So as yeah, of course.
Dr Slimson.
I thank the Minister for taking an intervention. In terms of the adaptations, do you think that's something within the housing bill that could be changed to allow park home residents, we still will pay council tax to local authorities, just like everyone else, to have those adaptations made just like other residents?
Minister.
As previously mentioned, Mr Fraser and I are discussing his amendments in the bill, and again I think there'll be one issue that we'll pick up and discuss how we can look at these in terms of that. For that, I think there's a number of other things. I think there's obviously recognising concerns about mis-selling, and that's a very insignificant impact it can have in individuals, and we've heard what similar cases have kind of come through. Consumer protection policy and advocacy and advice are devolved to the Scottish Government, and we promote services to residents locally in terms of that. Redress and, of course, enforcement are reserved to UK Government, so we are limited by the action it takes in this area. That might be something I can take away and write to my UK equivalent on that particular matter. Obviously, on access to justice, we're keen to support residents, and I continue to listen to the views that we coming through in terms from constituents, but also in the debate today. So residents can get support from Advice Direct Scotland and Trading Standards. Issues about site licensing can obviously be raised about the local authority, and we've touched about that as well in terms of that. Mr Fraser and I will be discussing around about the issue around about transferring disputes under the Mobile Homes Act 1983 from the Sheriff Court to the First Tier Tribunal. And as I said, Mr Fraser's laid an amendment, and we'll be discussing that next week. In relation to the 10% commission chargeable under the implied terms which govern the sale of a home, research in England has kind of suggested that a reduction can impact on the viability of smaller parks. But the point that Mr Ross made, I think, is a very important point. We've got to try and strike that balance. Of course, it's around about the viability of the park, but it's about protecting residents in terms of that as well. So finally, Presiding Officer, I want to thank Murdo Fraser for bringing the debate forward today. For members, which I think has been a very consensual debate, commend SCOPRA for its support to residents. Look forward to meeting them again. In terms, I also thank them for their proactive and collaborative work with stakeholders and work with Scottish Government, for example, in meetings with the Law Society and feeding back on licensing issues to local authorities. Pleased to be able to contribute to SCOPRA's conference last year, and I look forward to meeting Mr Fraser later this week and obviously working with SCOPRA in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate, and I suspend this meeting until 2:30 p.m. Thank you.